This is Open to Debate, and I'm John Donvan. Hi again, everybody. So after a lot of drama, it finally passed. Congress's one big, beautiful bill. Or maybe more correctly, the Republicans' big, beautiful bill. Or even more correctly, Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill, because he's the one who came up with the name. The big, beautiful bill does a lot on immigration, on Medicaid funding, on taxes, and that's just for starters. And we know it's divisive because the Democrats hated it. Not a single Democrat voted for it. But what has been interesting is how much the big, beautiful bill also divided the right. Why? Well, that's what we're going to be getting at in this episode with two debaters who are generally on the same page as conservatives, but they're on opposite sides for this one, which we're officially titling Two Conservatives Debate. Is the big, beautiful bill a disaster? So let's meet our two conservative debaters answering yes to the question, saying it's a disaster. I want to welcome Jessica Riedl. Jessica is an economist and currently senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where she focuses on budget and tax and economic policy. Previously, she worked as chief economist to Senator Rob Portman from Ohio and as staff director of the U.S. Senate Finance Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. Jessica, welcome to Open to Debate. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you, John.
And answering no to the question quite vociferously, saying it is not a disaster, I want to welcome Diana Furchtgott-Roth, also an economist who has held several key positions in Republican administrations from Reagan to Trump, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology in the Department of Transportation during Trump's first term. She is now the director of the Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment and a fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Diana, welcome to our program to Open to Debate.
Great to be with you.
It's so interesting hearing there are two credentials where you're both working now. You both used to work in each other's locations.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yes,
That's
we
right.
did.
Yes.
Okay, so you know the territory, obviously, and you know each other as well, as we understand, but you're here because you disagree very much on this proposition before us. Our rules for this debate: no personal attacks on your opponent, stay on topic, no endless repetition of the same talking points like over and over, and please listen to what your opponent is actually saying. So let's get to our opening statements. We want each of you to take a few minutes to tell us why you're answering yes or no to our question. Jessica, you are up first. You are arguing, yes, the big, beautiful bill is a disaster. That's a big word. Please tell us why.
Thanks, John. Thank you for all being here. Budget deficits are $1.8 trillion and on track to double to $3.6 trillion over the next decade. The national debt, which has already leaped from 40 to 100% of the economy since 2008, is headed towards 200% of the economy within 3 decades. Interest costs have tripled since 2021, surpassing Medicaid, Defense, and Medicare to become the second biggest budget item after Social Security. Within a decade, interest costs will hit $2 trillion annually, consuming 30% of all tax revenues, or all of the federal taxes you pay until April 20th. The nervous bond market is already forcing interest rates up. And the economists at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School cannot even project a long-term functioning economy under current debt trends. Their economic models crash. And yet, Washington's response to this debt is to pass the most expensive, budget-busting legislation since the 1960s, likely more expensive than the 2017 tax cuts, 2020 CARES Act, responding to the pandemic, and 2021 American Rescue Plan combined. A Republican Party that claims to care about budget deficits just poured gasoline on the fire. We are told that letting the TCJA expire would have been a disaster. Fine. But what about piling on expensive clutter like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no taxes on car loan interest payments? What about expensive bailouts for seniors and farmers? What about quadrupling the state and local tax deduction? Instead of offsetting the necessary parts of the TCJA extension, Congress stuffed the bill with special interest carve-outs and giveaways until the likely cost exceeds $5 trillion over the decade. That's as much as the Social Security shortfall over the next 3 decades over the same period. Now, Republican lawmakers promise that this bill will pay for itself with revenues from soaring economic growth. Nonsense. Extending the TCJA simply maintains current tax policies. They're not adding new pro-growth policies. And new carve-outs for SALT bailouts, senior bailouts, farmer bailouts, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime will do nothing to encourage working, saving, investing, and productivity. Instead, adding $5 trillion more in debt will raise interest rates, choke investment, and reduce growth. And this will combine with tariffs and new immigration restrictions to also cut economic growth. This is why most economic analyses of the bill on the left and the right agree that the new tax bill will show a small, temporary economic bump followed by a long-term economic decline. It is difficult to draft a tax cut bill so incompetently that it actually reduces long-term economic growth. But somehow President Trump and the GOP Congress pulled it off. And now the rest of us are left with budget deficits heading to $4 trillion a year, interest rates rising, and interest costs swallowing the federal budget.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Diana, you disagree. You're coming at this from the opposite side, arguing no, that it is not a disaster. Here's your chance, please, to make your case.
Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is about growth, not about debt. That is the correct order. America faced economic decline from the Biden approach of higher taxes, more regulation, and more spending. They weren't even going to allow you to choose your own car or your own stove, just as they took away your light bulbs. The Trump solution is first to get the economy growing and slow spending when possible. Once economic growth takes off and spending has been slowed, then it will be possible to deal with the debt. Here are just 4 of the many growth provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act to get the economy growing. First, the law not only keeps President Trump's low 2017 tax rates, which encourage people to work and businesses to expand, but gives predictability. Without the new law, a family earning median income would have paid another $3,000 a year. $3,000 is a lot of money, and all of you listening know that you can use it better than Uncle Sam. Second, the law means that family farms and small businesses don't have to be broken up when the owner dies. It does this by raising the estate tax exemption to $15 million per person and then adjusting it for inflation. That also gives predictability in investing and growing a business, which leads to more jobs. Third, the new law allows businesses to fully deduct the cost of the money they spend on buying equipment and buildings, rather than writing it off in segments over multiple years. And it makes this expensing permanent. This allows businesses to expand, buy more equipment, buy another building, hire more people to work on that equipment and in that building, and make more products. Fourth, and very important, the new law lowers your electricity costs by getting rid of tax credits for wind and solar. These made electricity more expensive and weakened the grid, causing blackouts. Lower electricity costs attract manufacturing from all over the world, and this means more jobs and more income for Americans. Our average residential electricity price was about 18 cents a kilowatt hour last year, compared to 39 cents a kilowatt hour in Germany. But China, Russia, and India have costs of less than a penny per kilowatt hour. I was talking to Anthony, who runs a small business, a car hire company. He said, and I quote, "All I want to do is to be able to live and pay my rent and take care of my 2 kids." Anthony was ecstatic about the new provision to deduct interest on car loans. Why? Because he'll be able to buy more cars, hire more drivers, and expand. The question is this a growth law or a debt law? This is a growth law. We need growth now so we can handle the debt in the future. We can deal with debt later when the economy is better. I admit that the law isn't perfect. All of us want more cuts in government spending to reduce the debt. But politics is a game of give and take. That's the American system. In the UK, where I was born and lived for many years, the Chancellor of the Exchequer stands up on Budget Day and announces all the tax and spending changes. There's no argument, they just go through. But our economy is different. We have a lot of give and take, and our economy is growing faster than the UK economy. In fact, it's growing faster than almost all the countries in the developed world. People all over the world not only want to come here to work, they also want to invest here. Imagine that it's January the 1st, 2026, and we didn't have this new law. All our taxes would go up. It would be one of the biggest tax increases in history. Businesses would have already started cutting back on investments, laying people off. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's a lot of good in this one big, beautiful bill act.
Thank you very much. I want to give you each a small assignment. I want to ask you, first to you, Jessica, where do you feel, in one sentence, seriously, that's the assignment, in one sentence, where do you feel that you and Diana fundamentally disagree on this issue as two conservatives?
I think we disagree on whether or not this bill is pro-growth and whether that matters more than the debt impact.
Diana?
Yeah, I would say that my opponent is correct on this, that I think that growth is more important. My opponent thinks debt is more important.
Okay.
And I think that all of you watching out there, when it comes to January the 1st, 2026, you will be happy that you have the opportunity for that growth.
Thank you.
You will be happy that your money
has
not gone to reducing the debt.
That's your second sentence, so I had to cut you off at that. The two of you fundamentally disagree on whether this bill is pro-growth or not. Jessica, you're making the case that the debt's a killer. You're making the argument that this bill is going to make things worse, that it's not pro-growth, that it's just going to ultimately raise rates and cause things to shrink. Diana, you're taking the opposite point of view. You're saying that you acknowledge that the debt will, for a time at least, continue to increase, but you're saying that the strategy is to get growth going first, and you think that this bill does that through several aspects of it, including the predictability that you said it has introduced, and you also specified that by getting rid of tax credits for wind and solar, it's going to help lower electrical costs, which is fundamental to, in your argument, to a growth agenda. So let me go first to you, Jessica. You've heard Diana say that fundamentally attacking the debt problem can wait, that growth has to come first. Now, I know you're saying that growth won't come, but what about the idea that let growth happen first and then debt can follow?
Diana said we need to deal with the debt. We need to deal with the debt later when the economy is better. The economy's been growing at 2 to 3% for the last couple of years, which is about the ceiling that we have seen since 2000. It's dipped in the last quarter or two due to the tariffs, but our general capacity has been about 2 to 3% for the last 25 years. If 2 to 3% growth isn't good enough to deal with the debt, when is? Do we think we're going to suddenly get to 4 and 5% economic growth? We haven't seen that in 30, 40 years, and that was only temporary. If we just say we're going to wait until then to deal with the debt, we're never going to deal with the debt. Moreover, even as Diana said, our economy is already the envy of the world. We can't keep putting it off. I would add that this approach hasn't ever happened in the past. In 2001, President Bush cut taxes. And instead of cutting spending, we ended up increasing spending over the next decade. In 2017, we cut taxes by $1.5 trillion. The spending cuts never came. As a matter of fact, the next year, Congress passed a 15% increase in discretionary spending.
So I want to before you go much further, because I think we see where you're going, and Diana sees where you're going with that, I want to let her respond to some of your arguments so far.
Well, as my opponent says, the economy has grown very nicely over the past 5 to 8 years. And that's because of President Trump's tax cuts in 2017. If this law had not passed, these tax cuts would have gone away. and there would have been a massive tax increase on the American people. So what we're doing is keeping these tax rates that powered the economic growth we've seen over the past, say, 7 years, since 2017. It's keeping the growth going. And that's what's very important, because we cannot have a massive tax hike on January 1st without seriously affecting the economy. And this bill that was signed into law, is better than the 2017 tax cuts in many ways, because it makes the taxes permanent, so investors don't have to worry that at some point in the future taxes are going to go up. Plus, this is accompanied by regulatory reform. President Trump is making vast strides to, for example, end the requirement that people buy electric vehicles. He's ending requirements that allowing that California set standards for the United States.
Can I jump in for a moment just to get a check-in from your opponent on the first point that you made, that if taxes were to go up, it would be so severely disruptive that it's just not something that one would want to imagine.
I agree that we would not want the entire tax cut law to expire. That would cause a tax hike that would have some economic effect. But that doesn't require adding on all of this dead weight to bring the cost to $5 trillion and reduce the economic effect. You could have had the
dead weight would include what?
The dead weight: no tax on tips, SALT, no tax on overtime, no tax on car interest.
And SALT, you want to explain what that's?
The state and they increased the tax deduction for state and local taxes from $10,000 to $40,000, which is generally a giveaway to high earners, or in this case, mostly upper middle class earners, because there is a phase out. That doesn't help the economy. I think we could have had the pro-growth elements without the cost if we had offset it rather than added more clutter.
So if I could say a note about that, if I could say a note about that of course, theoretically, we could have. But then there are people who say, if we're just going to keep the taxes the way they are, then that isn't going to be progressive. That's going to help better off people, but it's not going to help poor people. And that's why they added no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. There was $6,000 for seniors. But these all phase out. These are all for middle income taxpayers. They all phase out around the $250,000 a year income. They're not for everybody. But these were added specifically so that politicians wouldn't be accused of favoring the rich. And why are they accused of favoring the rich? Because the top half of American earners pay 97% of the taxes. The top 1% pays 40% of all taxes. The top 10% pays 72% of the taxes. So if we keep the taxes the same, just keep them the same, as my opponent is suggesting, then there will be a windfall for people in upper income groups that politicians object to. So they added these other measures.
About those other measures, Jessica, you tweeted in June, I'm going to quote your tweet, "They throw together a pile of populist clutter and special interest getaways and then assume by magic that the economy will soar." I just want to check in with Diana. Do you agree with the designation of these things that you were just talking about as being politically convenient as clutter, that those things are clutter, taxes on tips and concessions for seniors?
I would say that the process of passing legislation in the United States requires that everyone be kept happy. And that you cannot it's very difficult to pass a clean bill. This isn't like the United Kingdom, where the chancellor stands up and says, this is the way it's going to be. You have to persuade everybody. And this bill, the bill passed very narrowly. I mean, it almost did not pass at all. And there was a lot of discussion between the senators. And then there was discussion between the House members. Are they going to take this final result? And most bills in the United States contain these different sweeteners to get them across party lines. It's the system of checks and balances that we have here in the United States, and that makes it very difficult for any bill to pass at all, which other countries don't understand, but this is actually an advantage.
It's necessary clutter, then, is what the argument is.
I remember when the conservative position on taxes was broaden the base and lower the rates. Get rid of excessive deductions, get rid of excessive carve-outs, treat people equally in the tax tax code. Instead, we have a no tax on tips policy that says if you're the wait staff, you get a tax cut, but if you're in the kitchen cooking at the restaurant, you don't get a tax cut. We have no tax on overtime, which is just going to invite gaming. This is not what conservative tax reform has ever been.
But I don't hear your opponent defending this particular tax. I hear her making the argument that the game is set up such that you have to sweeten the deal to get the larger bill through.
Republicans control the government. They have no one to blame for this. The fact that Republicans can't get their own team together to be fiscally responsible and offset it does not justify the bill. Republicans aren't powerless here. They are the ones ultimately to blame for not being able to pass a tax bill unless they push the cost to $5.5 trillion. I'm also old enough to remember when Republicans beat up Joe Biden and the American Rescue Plan for turning a stimulus bill into a big government Christmas tree of carve-out of special interest provisions at a cost of $2 trillion. Republicans are doing the same thing.
Well, I would say, as a conservative, the deductibility of the interest from auto loans, the state and local tax deduction, the Social Security tax break, the no tax on tips and on overtime, that allows people to keep more of their money, which is a valid conservative position. Of course, I would prefer a 10% tax across the board, a 10% flat tax, but we're not going to get it in this political situation. We have to make do with our constraints. We have to optimize according to constraints. And this is an excellent bill for optimizing according to constraints because there's a lot of pro-growth material. I'm not unhappy that the American people have $5 trillion and the government does not have $5 trillion. We can spend it better than the federal government.
I would say at a $5 trillion cost, they weren't optimizing any constraints. They were piling on costs. They were writing new provisions in right before the vote just to win over votes. This is not how the sausage should be made. They went around the committee process, and in the end, we're adding expensive provisions just to buy the votes of the remaining holdout lawmakers. That is an ugly way to make policy, and you don't have to do it this way. A competent, fiscally conservative party does not have to do it this way. But, ultimately, Republicans turned this into a political exercise of how do we buy off different demographics, how do we buy off different voters, rather than how do we set a fiscally responsible limit on the cost.
Did it have that option politically?
I think ultimately President Trump could have gotten whatever he wanted on this. If President Trump would have said, get rid of some of the clutter, lower the cost, find more offsets, the same Republicans who tell me privately I had to vote for the bill at risk of crossing President Trump would have voted for that bill at the risk of crossing President Trump. They're not helpless. These are members of Congress, the first branch of government.
Well, to give you one example of some of this clutter, and let me admit that this provision is clutter. It was added at the last moment. It didn't go through any of the committees. It was made to appease one senator, Lisa Murkowski. So she had a provision added that did phased out the end of the credits for wind and solar so that they could be used until 2028 rather than until the end of the year. So that cost more money. But she said she wasn't going to vote for it unless this was added. So this was made to make her happy. And this is an example. Well, my opponent knows full well how the political process worked because my opponent had the advantage of working on Capitol Hill for one of the leading senators.
Let's pivot to another big aspect of this bill, and that's what will amount to cuts in Medicaid. It's a complicated process by which that happens, but the estimate is that roughly $1 trillion will be cut over the next decade, and that the Congressional Budget Office is itself saying that would result in 12 million people losing coverage by 9 years from now. Your response to that?
I think my first point on Medicaid is I think Republicans should not have dishonestly promised at the outset that no one would lose Medicaid coverage and that Medicaid would not be cut. Of course, that was a lie. But I will say that there is room for responsible Medicaid savings. Since 2013, the number of people in poverty has dropped by 10 million, and yet inflation-adjusted Medicaid spending has doubled, with 10 million fewer poor people. I think there was some good in this bill on Medicaid. Reducing the provider tax gimmick essentially makes it more difficult for states to lie about how much money they're spending on Medicaid in order to get extra reimbursements. I think allowing states more often to confirm the eligibility of their Medicaid recipients can make sure that it's going to the right people. What I did not like in the bill was the Medicaid work requirements. I do like work requirements for some benefits, but in Medicaid, not only is it a major paperwork burden that can end up costing benefits for people who even are working, but how do you enforce a Medicaid work requirement? If you kick people off Medicaid for not going to work, they're just going to go to the emergency room, which costs even more money and will be bailed out by taxpayers. Or is the policy that we're not even going to let you go to the emergency room and that we're going to let sick people die in the parking lot of a hospital because they didn't go to work that day? The question for Medicaid work requirements is, are you going to let a 5-year-old die in a hospital parking lot because mom missed work?
Jessica, when you are arguing, as the question asks, was this bill a disaster? Is this part of what makes it disastrous in your view?
I don't think it's the worst part of the bill because honestly, I don't think the Medicaid work requirements are even going to be implemented. Blue states are not going to do it. I don't think so. And ultimately, I do not believe that we are going to let people die in the parking lot, which means that the savings won't come. I'm glad that we're not going to do that to people, but it also means the promised savings probably won't materialize.
Okay, let's let Diana respond.
Well, the mother with a 5-year-old is not going to lose Medicaid coverage because mothers with children under 14 can keep their Medicaid coverage. Point one. Point two, I think this is a very pro-growth aspect of the bill. Able-bodied people should work in return for having these benefits. We have 50 different states. They have work requirements for different kinds of programs, and they manage to make this operate properly. And individuals don't have to work 40 hours a week. They don't even have to work. They have to volunteer, go to school, or work 80 hours a month. That's basically about half-time. People who are disabled, women who are looking after children who are 14 and under, women who are pregnant are not subject to the new requirement. So I think that everybody benefits, if they can, from working, and the law tried to carve out people who could work. And it used to be that able-bodied people couldn't get Medicaid at all. So even being able to get Medicaid is a very big change from what it used to be. But if I have time, the fundamental problem is the Affordable Care Act made every healthcare plan into a Cadillac plan. So the new healthcare plans, in order to qualify, they have to have unlimited lifetime coverage. They have to have mental health coverage. They have to have maternity coverage even if you don't want to have a child. They have to have drug abuse coverage even if you don't think you're going to take drugs. So as a result, a lot of the bare bones plans that were affordable disappeared. And people were put on Medicaid. They went on Medicaid because they could no longer buy these bare bones affordable plans. Health insurance has just become a lot more expensive because it's required to be a Cadillac plan for everybody. That's the fundamental problem.
So a lot of mitigating factors brought by your opponent to the issue of the Medicaid cuts.
Again, the way Medicaid work requirements save money is primarily by not providing health care to sick people who may not have fulfilled the requirements. And again, that gets back to the question, how do you not provide health care for them? Do you send them to the emergency room where they're going to currently go, or do you let them die in the parking lot? Diana points out correctly that there are exemptions in the bill, and I think that's good. But again, if it's going to save any money, it would have to not apply to anybody for it, or it have to actually apply to somebody in order to save money. I'll also say on Medicaid, I do believe as a equal opportunity deficit hawk that Medicaid should be on the table for savings. As I said earlier, we've lost 10 million fewer people in poverty, but the costs have doubled. I think everything should be on the table. But I think using Medicaid savings to cut taxes instead of being part of a bipartisan, all-on-the-table deficit grand deal will justifiably anger people. I think it's one thing for Medicaid to pay the price for deficit reduction that all programs are paying. I think it's another thing to say we are going to kick people off Medicare so that rich people can get a bigger state and local tax deduction.
You meant Medicaid.
I'm sorry, Medicaid. So that rich people can get a bigger SALT deduction. That's a little harder to swallow for people.
Well, the new deductions for state and local taxes are income limited.
Right,
So-
up $500,000. It starts phasing out at $500,000 worth of income, which is still pretty rich. And even then, it only slightly phases out. So you're still talking about people making $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 a year, getting a huge tax break in addition to the rate cuts they're already getting. To me, where I come from in Wisconsin, that's still rich.
The problem is with these state and local deductions is that you have taxpayers all over the country subsidizing high tax states. So if you are the New York governor, you can have a very high tax rate, and then that property tax, the state and local income tax becomes deductible against your federal taxes. And if you are in Texas where you have a low income tax, then you are basically paying for the income taxes of New Yorkers. So this is really a major problem that needs to be solved. But I wanted to ask my opponent, it sounds as though you're in favor of a national health service. Are you in favor of nationalizing health, of the public, of the government paying all health for everybody?
Of course not. Of course I'm not. That's a red herring. Of course I'm not calling for national health care, but I am saying that you're not going to save money by kicking people off Medicaid and providing them emergency care instead at the emergency room. Unless, let me ask, is your position that if somebody who is subject to the work requirements doesn't go to work or doesn't get the paperwork filed in time and they get sick, let's say they have a real medical emergency, should they get government subsidized care at an emergency room or should they die in the hospital parking lot?
The way the system is set up is hospitals in the United States, they take everybody and they sort out the insurance afterwards. So this is basically to motivate people to work.
Right.
Hospitals have funds and they treat everybody, even the uninsured, which is one reason, by the way, that medical care costs are high for those people who are insured.
Well, that uncompensated care ends up mostly getting billed to Medicaid. So ultimately, the taxpayer, Medicaid still ends up paying for uncompensated care. Hospitals swallow some of it, but most of it ends up being funded by Medicaid anyway.
Are you making a moral argument or an economic argument?
I'm making a moral and economic argument.
Where's the moral part?
I think the moral part is I'm a conservative. I like work requirements. I don't think that we should let somebody die in a hospital parking lot. I think we are a rich enough country that we should not let people die in a hospital parking lot. If that makes me a socialist, then I guess I'm a socialist. That doesn't mean I want national health coverage. It doesn't mean I want the Canadian system. It just means if somebody has an emergency and they go to the emergency room, I think they should get care.
But they do. It's setting up a straw man to say people are going to be dying in parking lots.
Well,
the example you gave about the mother with the 5-year-old, she would continue to be covered by Medicaid.
Okay, fine. A mother with a 17-year-old. I mean, what happens to them?
They go into the hospital and they are covered. That's what happens.
By who? Who pays for it?
There are funds in hospitals who are paid.
And where do those funds? Who reimburses those funds? Medicaid.
Well, these funds are reimbursed by Medicaid, but having this work requirement is not going to mean that everybody abides by it, but a large share of people will be incentivized to go out and get a job. Just as when I first entered the workforce, I had to work in order to get health insurance. If I didn't work, I wouldn't have any health insurance, and I had to work. So it was like that before the Affordable Care Act.
Another pivot. The way that this bill came about, just in terms of what happened at a parliamentary level, is that part of your critique?
Oh my goodness, where do we start? First, they abused the reconciliation process, which is supposed to be a very specific process that was created to cut deficits in order to increase deficits. It was also created with the Byrd rule that it cannot increase long-term deficits. They ignored that. They lied about the score. They used a current policy baseline for the current tax cuts, which is pretending that extensions don't have any cost. But then they wanted credit for putting new expiration dates in the future tax cuts. So in other words, we should ignore the past expiration dates, but we want credit for putting new expiration dates, both to lie about the cost. Then when the Congressional Budget Office revealed that it would not grow the economy and that tax cuts actually do cost money, they smeared the CBO and overrode the score. Overall, the bill had no legitimate true committee process. Everything was run by leadership. The major policies were determined by last-minute tweaks to win holdovers. They overrode all of Congress's anti-deficit rules. And then after it came out, the White House flat out lied about the provisions. They put out press releases claiming that they had completely eliminated taxes on Social Security benefits, lying to seniors. There is no such provision. They also put out dishonesty, like the average family would have had their taxes go up 68% without this bill. That is false too. I think this ultimately shredded the budget process, which Republicans are allowed to do. They're the majority. They can do whatever they want. But the budget process was already hanging by a thread.
With what negative consequences then?
The negative consequence is that whatever slight breaks we had in the system on budget deficits are now long gone.
Okay.
The next time Democrats run the government, they can now do whatever they want and use the same gimmicks to increase deficits.
Let's take it to Diana, please.
Well, CBO's modeling of the 2017
Congressional Budget Office.
Yeah, the Congressional Budget Office modeling of the 2017 tax cuts slightly underestimated growth because they didn't take into account growth from the tax provisions. And CBO doesn't model how permitting reform and expanded access to energy resources will truly affect growth. It's very difficult to model the positive effects of deregulation. And this new law has a lot of deregulation. The Federal Reserve has the best economists in the country. Some might say the best economists in the world, but they tend to systematically underpredict growth in Republican administrations because they don't take the positive effects of regulatory reform into account. And they overpredict growth in Democrat administrations because they don't take the overregulation into account. So under President Biden, for example, saying that the majority of cars sold had to be battery-powered electric by 2035. I mean, that has negative effects on growth, but that's not modeled by CBO. I mean, people have to buy more expensive cars. They have to wait a couple of hours to charge up in the middle of the day if they're small businesses with landscape companies. And similarly, the positive effects of rolling back these regulations are not accounted for either. It's very difficult to model these, and I'm not criticizing these economists. I'm just saying economists are smart, but they cannot model everything.
Diana said that CBO mismodeled the 2017 tax cuts. Their first baseline they came out with after the 2017 tax cuts, which was in early 2018, predicted revenues up to the pandemic with a 99.5% accuracy rate. They were at CBO got it 99.5% right up until the pandemic. And the 0.5% error was being too rosy for Republicans. So they actually slightly overestimated. Now, it's hard to judge the score of the tax cuts when the pandemic started because the pandemic, you have the pandemic response, immigration, inflation. You can't unwind all of those. But no, CBO's accuracy up to the pandemic was 99.5%.
I really think that we need to be focusing on the growth of the economy, on the jobs people are going to have, and where we would have been without this law rather than where we are right now. We need to do a comparison. The American people are better off, have more opportunities, have more money with this bill than without.
I just want to ask you again very briefly, you met the assignment very well before, but in 2 sentences this time, what are, in your view, I'll go to you first, Diane, on this, what are the best aspects of the bill and the worst aspects of the bill?
The best aspects of the bill are that it keeps tax rates low permanently. It gives investors and workers incentives to work, incentives to invest. It pulls in money from all over the world to the United States. Also, and we haven't discussed this, has more border security, and that's going to lower crime, which is going to help cities save money. So that's important too. And the worst aspects of the bill, the ones that I fought the most to prevent, are the long phase outs of the wind and solar tax credits.
Takes too long, you're saying?
Yeah, they're phasing out in 28, and if there's a Democrat House, then that could be put off permanently, and we might never lose these subsidies. And why is that bad? It's because wind and solar need backups, and the layering of wind and solar with their tax incentives on the grid is making the grid less reliable and more open to blackouts, according to the North America Electric Reliability Corporation. And we have dangers of blackouts in the region of the country.
We're beyond 2 sentences. I'm sorry, I have to jump in. Jessica, your shot at this.
I would say the positive aspects of the tax cuts are the permanent expensing and immediate deduction of many business investments in R&D that are very good for growth. The higher standard deduction and policies that make it easier for people to use a standard deduction instead of itemize.
I agree.
And permanence and predictability are always good things. Whether I support the policy or not, those are good. Mm-hmm. The negatives, as I've said, $5.5 trillion cost, special interest clutter, and no real plan to fix the budget deficit.
Okay, thank you. You both went beyond 2 sentences, but it was pretty succinct in any case. I'll put commas in your thoughts then rather than periods.
Yeah.
Has there been any bill without special interest clutter?
I mean, it's a matter of degree. I think the special interest clutter far exceeded the good policies in this bill.
I want to welcome some guest questioners into the program now, starting with Sahil Kapoor. Sahil is a senior national political reporter for NBC News, covering Capitol Hill and elections. Sahil, thanks so much for listening in and now for joining us. And please come on in with your question.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm actually on Capitol Hill right now, just above the Senate floor. I wanted to follow up on the issue of the process by which this bill was written and current policy baseline. I believe this is the first time it's ever happened in the Senate under the filibuster-proof reconciliation process. So my question for both Diana and Jessica is, do either of you have any doubt that this process will be used again by future Senate majorities, including Democrats, down the road to avoid paying for their priorities? And overall, whether your personal priority is about debt or growth, do you see this as a good thing or a bad thing?
I see this as a disaster that will be replicated by Democrats. Here's what will happen next time. When Democrats get elected, next time they run the government, they can do a cheap 1-year increase in, say, the child tax credit or family and medical leave or education. It's only a 1-year cost. It's not that big. And then next year say, well, current policy baseline, we're just going to get rid of the expiration date because it's already policy, and now we don't have to pay for it forever. So they opened a major Pandora's box. And moreover, just the fact that we can change the scores of bills on the floor. Democrats could bring Medicare for All or the Green New Deal to the floor and just override the score. And essentially all of the limits on budget deficits that have existed since 1974 are shredded. I think as a deficit hawk, this is a disaster.
So, yes, to answer your question, yes, this process could be used by the Democrats, but this is a popular law. It'll stop taxes going up. As my opponent said, the expensing provisions are very, very good for the economy. The auto loans, they're going to help people purchase new cars, and a lot of these provisions are going to grow the economy. Growing the economy is popular. Of course, the Democrats can use the process for a kind of bill that does the opposite, that shrinks the economy, that raises taxes. And I'm sure if they had the opportunity, they would do it. But they didn't win the presidency. They didn't win the House. They didn't win the Senate. They were doing a terrible job. They wouldn't even let you choose the car you want to drive. They got thrown out. So if they try this again, they're going to get thrown out again.
So in asking the question, are you sharing with us a conversation that's happening on the Hill? Very much so, a sense that the rules that we just saw broken or redefined will carry forward into the future?
I am. The reason I ask that is because I've spoken to Democratic senators who say they're going to use this exact process again down the road. One very easy way to envision this is there are ACA tax credits that are expiring. If Democrats were in charge right now, they could make those permanent for a decade or more at a cost of zero. So any program that's currently in existence that is set to expire down the road could be extended at a cost of zero under this new precedent. So I'm trying to explore the ways this can be used and likely will at this point be used. I guess my follow-up would be, if we're using this process, to get around the 60 vote threshold for something this big on party lines, why even have a filibuster? Do both of you think that the Senate may as well eliminate the filibuster if this is going to be the new precedent?
I like the filibuster. When Democrats were trying to eliminate the filibuster, I opposed that. But ultimately, we're abusing the reconciliation process so much that we may as well eliminate the filibuster and put everything in reconciliation. In 1974, it wasn't written into the law, but reconciliation was created to reduce budget deficits. It was not created to pick one bill and stuff all of a party's policies into that one bill, and then have to make really weird tweaks to be compliant with the Senate parliamentarian and put in all sorts of bad policies to blow up the deficit. Instead of getting rid of the filibuster, at this point, I think we should get rid of the reconciliation process, because at this point, it is just destroying the legislative process and becoming a tool to ram poorly written, partisan, budget-busting bills through Congress. If you believe in the filibuster, as I do, then the reconciliation monster has passed its time.
Well, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act was also an example of this kind of bill, and it had $1 trillion worth of credits for clean energy, which destabilized the grid. It had a lot of handouts for infrastructure projects that were very poorly constructed, very poorly funded, by requiring union labor, for example, leaving out a lot of the workforce. So, yes, when a party gets in, they can use these measures. But as I said, the Democrats decisively lost the election. And if they try the same thing again, raising taxes on American people, taking away the right to drive the cars they want to drive, weakening the electricity grid, they're going to lose the next election too. The Democrats have to learn that they need to fit in with what Americans want. Americans want low taxes. They want growth. Just as Anthony said, he wants to be able to pay his rent, to look after his kids, and he likes those auto-deductible loans.
Sahil, thank you very much for your question and for the time you gave to listening to the debate. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome in Taylor Giorno. Taylor is a reporter for Notice and covers policy and lobbying. Taylor, welcome to Open to Debate. Thanks for listening in, and please come on in with your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So my question is sort of a long one. Before the bill passed, there were several Republican members of Congress who told Notice that they were not happy with it. Keith Self called it quote unquote broken, Chip Roy called it quote unquote a travesty, and Josh Hawley said that centering Medicaid cuts was quote unquote morally wrong and politically suicidal. The list goes on, but every one of those Republicans ended up voting for the bill, with just 3 Republican senators and 2 Republican House members voting against it. So you guys have kind of alluded to this. Do you think, as 2 conservatives, do you think that the bill and the divisive nature of it is going to help or hurt Republicans?
Thank you. It's a good question. I would say first, I have noted, as you have, that Republicans talk a good game. I'm going to be independent. I'm going to push this bill. I'm going to oppose it. But ultimately, we've essentially devolved into a parliamentary system where when you vote, you're essentially voting for a party, and nobody has the courage to cast the deciding vote against their president, at least nobody in the Republican Party. We had Manchin and Sinema on the Democratic side. So to me, I'm old school. I come from an era of strong, committee bull chairmen. I like having different centers of power. I like having a committee process. I like having members not just be rubber stamps. And I think this is going to hurt the Republicans in the midterms. And the reason is, Diana may be correct that letting the tax cuts expire would be really unpopular, but you don't get congratulated by voters for the crises you averted. And so ultimately the number of people affected by no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on auto interest is going to be very small and they're not going to vote on it. But the Democrats are probably going to be very motivated to run against the provisions they don't like and the cost. And like I said, Republicans can run on it, but you don't get credit from voters for the tax hikes you averted. You get credit for the changes that you did make. So even if that's a little unfair to Republicans that they won't get credit for it, they won't.
I think the economy is going to be really strong next year. There's going to be a lot of investment that's going to go. There's going to be a lot of job creation. And I think that members of Congress and senators are going to be able to run on this very profitably. And people are going to know if they pay $3,000 or $4,000 more in taxes or if they don't. They're not really going to know if the deficit is 1.8 trillion or 1.9 trillion or even 2 trillion, because these numbers are so large that they are meaningless. What I see is the president barnstorming the country with any members of the House or the Senate that have problems and having being able to run very successfully on this growth bill, because it's a growth bill. People care about growth. They care about jobs. They care about paying their rent. And these huge trillion-dollar deficit numbers are not within most people's comprehension.
So, Taylor, I hear a clear divide in the answers that we got to your question. But do you have a follow-up as you listen to what they were saying?
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow up on one of the last points that you guys talked about, which I also think is going to be a potential sticking point for voters. Special interest in the role of money in politics is unpopular across demographics. And you seem to be at odds over whether the amount of sweeteners or special interest provisions in the bill was the right amount. So I guess my question is, what is the appropriate amount of special interest provisions, which, as Diana noted earlier in the debate, is a unique facet of the American policymaking process?
Well, it might be a unique facet of the American policymaking process, but other countries have actual cash under the table. I mean, very, very open payment of politicians. And so this kind of arm twisting and favors, it's not unique to the United States. But this is a matter of negotiation. No one can get everything they want. Half a loaf is better than none, which is why, in the end, all these senators, they ended up voting for the bill despite their prior objections. And even more surprising, the House took the Senate bill as it was passed and gave it the stamp of approval, allowing President Trump to sign it into law.
Taylor, the sense of that I have of your question is there a point where it becomes too much? Is there too much giving away of stuff? And I just want to bring that question back to Diana. Does it get to be too much?
Well, I'm sure any amount is too much, but we can't avoid it. I mean, we do not have the perfect system, although perhaps in a sense we do. Very few bills pass. And if you look at how people are moving, how people are voting with their feet, they're moving from other countries in the world. Millions of people want to come to the United States. Investment is pouring into the United States. If you look at the United States as a whole, people are moving from high-tax states to low-tax states. People are moving from states that have high crime, such as Illinois, to states that have lower crime, such as Indiana. So we know what people want by observing where they go. And I think we have a wonderful system, and we are the envy of the world, truly.
The sweeteners that were added to this bill was not we building a road in someone's district. It's not a little Cornhusker kickback. It's not a new highway. It's not a new grant. There was roughly $2 trillion in additional provisions added to a pure extension of the tax cuts. I'm talking about mostly things like the SALT cap, which going to 40,000, which was a huge giveaway to upper middle class and high earners. When you're having to add $2 trillion to a bill just to get it passed, you have long since gone way beyond what makes it worth it. I think there are some good things in this bill. I don't think they're worth $2 trillion of sweeteners. In fact, I wanted them to be offsetting some of these policies instead of adding that much new waste that you and I are all going to have to pay for in new debt.
Thanks, Taylor, very much for joining us with your question. Really appreciate it. We're going to come up to our closing round shortly, and that's where you each get to make closing statements. But before we do, I want to turn to one other topic that came up in passing in your comments, Diana, and that is the provisions in the bill for immigration enforcement. And I think your argument was that that also would support growth. Can you make that case?
Yes, if we have millions.
And share with us what the what the bill is stipulating for immigration.
Yeah, so the bill gives more for border enforcement because we've seen that when we have millions of people coming across the border into Texas, then being bused or flown into other major cities into the United States, we see people on the sidewalks, people who can't be looked after properly. The cities have to look after them. There's higher crime. And so having a reduced level of crime with the additional border enforcement and also the disincentives for people to come, which are going to be with this border enforcement, is going to increase growth. It gives cities more money for other things that they want or to lower their own taxes.
I mean, virtually all economists on the left and right agree that immigration increases growth because it increases labor supply. The more workers you have, the faster the economy grows. This is not controversial. In fact, one of the main reasons the economy is growing more slowly each decade is because the growth of the labor force is shrinking. So, I mean, the fact that cutting immigration hurts growth is not even controversial in economics. I would also add, for what it's worth, that most immigrants who come to the country, even those who come illegally, and I do think that we should curtail illegal immigration, are not homeless in the streets. They're not criminals. In fact, the immigrants coming into America have a lower crime rate than current citizens. I do think we should strengthen the border. I do think that every country in the world needs an immigration system where we pick who comes into our country. But just if we're talking pure economics, of course immigration increases the economy, and the immigrants we have generally added to GDP, not reduced it.
So you said any economist would know that, but you are an economist, and I don't think you're.
I didn't mean virtually any.
Virtually, okay.
I'm an economist. I'm in favor of legal immigration because the skills of immigrants complement the skills of the U.S. workforce. There are a lot of people who want to come here legally who don't have a high school diploma, who work on farms and nursing homes. There are a lot of legal immigrants who have PhDs in math and science, and they are employed by startups. But these legal immigrants who want to come and who add to our society are very different from illegal immigrants who just pour across the border and who commit crimes and who bring drugs. And we in the United States should have the choice of who we let into our country and who we don't. And I fully agree we need more immigration. We need more legal immigration rather than illegal immigration.
I think it's unfair to say that to imply that the majority of immigrants are bringing drugs and crime into the country. That's just false.
I didn't imply the majority. I said some were bringing drugs and crime into the country. You can see them on the sidewalks of major cities, including New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago.
Again, I mean, your emphasis when you're on it suggests that you think this is a major problem, that there is a major wave of new crime. No, the crime rate is not zero for immigrants, but again, they have a lower crime rate than the native-born.
All right, we're going to move to our closing round. That's where we have closing remarks by each of our debaters. They'll have up to 2 minutes to one more time tell us why they're answering yes or no to our question. Was the big, beautiful bill a disaster? Jessica, you are up first in our closing round. The floor is yours.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun. I am a fiscal conservative. I have spent the past 25 years working in mostly Republican circles on tax and budget policy. I've worked with Republican presidents. I've been near the top of Republican presidential campaigns. I've worked with Republican leaders in Congress. And I can say that the GOP tax bill is not fiscally conservative. It is not fiscally conservative to add $5 trillion to already soaring budget deficits. It is not fiscally conservative to drastically cut taxes without also cutting spending, because then all you're doing is deferring the taxes with interest. It is not fiscally conservative to abandon conservative tax reforms. Remember, broaden the base, lower the rates, anyone? And instead stuff the tax code with special interest giveaways in order to win over lawmakers and interest groups. And it is not fiscally conservative to spend hundreds of billions of dollars bailing out seniors, farmers, and high-income coastal voters. And it is not fiscally conservative to bypass the committee process, attack the scorekeepers, hide the final cost, and then for the White House to circulate deceptive claims like they have ended taxes on Social Security taxes. This is legislation from a Republican Party that, it pains me to say, has given up on providing energetic conservative solutions to our economic challenges and has instead settled for lazy, budget-busting pandering to interest groups. Here's the thing, though. You can spin the cost, as the Republicans in Congress are. You can pretend the tax cuts are free, as Republicans in Congress are, and you can change the scoring rules, as they did. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the deficit still soars, interest rates still rise, the bond market still gets squeezed, and Moody's still downgrades our credit rating. You can't spin the economy in the bond market, and the rest of us will be left holding the bag for this legislation.
Thank you, Jessica. And Diana, you have the final word. Your closing statement, please.
Well, growth is the engine, debt is the backseat driver. We've heard a lot about debt today, but debt is a balance sheet issue. You need to grow your company to pay off the debt. We need growth, more investment, more jobs, more income for Americans to shrink the deficits and debt as a share of the entire economy. The deficit numbers don't account for the growth in the economy caused by the certainty of lower tax rates and reforming complicated regulations that stop people starting businesses or hiring the workers that they need to hire. They don't account for the growth from people being able to deduct business expenses immediately and permanently. These deficit numbers don't account for the reduction in crime that comes from increased border security. They don't count for the growth associated with a more peaceful world that comes with greater attention to national defense. Due to all these measures in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, our economy will grow faster. On January 1st, 2026, all of you will be glad that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will take effect because you won't be facing a tax increase, you will be facing a tax cut. And that's going to benefit you and the economy in the long run, and then we will be able to deal with the debt.
Thank you very much, Diana. And that is a wrap on this debate. And I want to thank our debaters, Diana Furchtgott-Roth and Jessica Riedl. We not only appreciate your showing up to debate, but what you did is prove our point, which is that you can have robust disagreement and do so civilly. So thank you both for taking part in the way that you did. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our guest questioners for coming in. Thank you, Sahil and Taylor. And finally, a thank you to you, our audience, for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. As a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you, by the Rosencrantz Foundation, and by supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Clay O'Connor. Leah Mathau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. Andrew Lipson is head of production. Michelle Debrasini is our director of marketing. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlette Sandoval. Editorial and research by Gabriella Mayer. Max Fulton and Julia Sirkin provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Annalisa Cochran, Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Linda Lee, Mary Regis, and Tom Bunting. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement, and I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.